Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me all right? I'm not used to talking with mics, so if I drift away or if I get too loud, let me know. But thank you for coming. As they say in Italy, benvenuto, which means welcome. And yeah, I'm going to lead you on a little tour of Venice. I want to tell you a lot about the history of the city and how it was built, because it's a fascinating story. And then we'll talk about modern day Venice and what it's like, what everyday life is like there, and some of the struggles that the city deals with regard to tourism and so on. And then I have a really, I think, a fun photo tour of the city, so that if you've never been, how many of you have been to Venice before? Oh wow, so it'll be like going back home then for you. But okay, well, let's get started. So my relationship with Venice, if you will, started 25 years ago. My first visit was in 2000, and my latest visit was just last November. I got back in the fall, and it's of all the as Jennifer mentioned, I've traveled to 35 different countries around the world. Italy is by far my favorite country, and Venice is my favorite city in the world, bar none. I just adore it. Cumulatively, I have spent about 2 years of my life in Italy, just going back for repeated trips and for doing research as a university professor and so on. And I'd say about 6 months of that has been spent in the Venice area, so I know the city really well. I've brought my students there, I've brought friends from the States there, and I've made a lot of friends in the local area, so that's an added plus, because we get to hang out and I get to see kind of an insider's view of the region. So I love this quote. I like to start out with this: if I were not king of France, I would choose to be a citizen of Venice. So that was Henry III back in the 16th century, and I heartily agree. So I want to tell you a bit about the history of Venice and kind of how it came to be. It was originally the Roman Republic was founded back in the 6th century BC. And over about 700 years, it expanded its empire all across Europe and into North Africa and parts of Asia. The peak of Roman power was around 117 AD. And by that time, it had accumulated a population of about 70 million citizens. And that was about a third of the world population at the time, which is pretty amazing. Roman culture and the infrastructure, the aqueducts, the roads they built, some of them are still in existence and still some in use today, which is pretty amazing. When we think of our own plumbing, it's like, how can this aqueduct still be delivering water 2,000 years later? So Rome had, of course, an enormous influence on Europe and the world. This is a map of the farthest expansion of the Roman Empire, where it reached its peak around 117 AD. So as you see, they had parts of Britain. They got stopped at Hadrian's Wall in Scotland. They were into Greece and Croatia and Turkey and the northern coast of Africa, and most of Europe was under Roman rule at that time. There's been a lot written and talked about with regard to the decline of the Roman Empire and why it happened. There were several reasons. There were moral issues. The emperors, the infamous emperors Nero and Caligula, they spent massive amounts of public money on lavish banquets. Prostitution began to flourish in the Roman Empire. Then diseases spread as a result of that. There was widespread political corruption, excessive taxation, especially of the middle class, starting to sound kind of familiar. And they were trying to fund far-off wars and maintain the outer boundaries of the empire. There was high unemployment. The currency became very inflated. And then as Christianity rose to influence, people were wanting to turn away from war and battling and conquering. And so for all these reasons, the Roman Empire started to decline. Uprisings then started in some of the outer areas of the empire, in Britannia, which is now England, in Gaul, which is now France, and in Judea, which is now Israel. The Romans had overextended their military, and they didn't have enough soldiers to maintain this, so they began hiring people in the local areas to help keep the peace. But these people had no real loyalty to Rome, so they weren't terribly reliable. By the end of the 3rd century, areas at the edges of the empire were being attacked by local tribes, and ultimately they intruded into the Roman homelands, and this is what we know as the barbarian invasions. Some of the major invasions that came into the Roman Empire, the Huns came in from Central Asia, and they invaded France, Greece, and northern Italy. The Goths were a Germanic tribe, and they were actually running away from the Huns, and they came into the empire and originally sought safety within the Roman Empire from the Huns, and then began to eat away at the Roman Empire as well. The Vandals, we still have that word today. They were a Germanic tribe, and they took parts of France, Spain, and North Africa, and then started to attack the Italian peninsula itself. They started to take the islands of Sicily and Sardinia. And then we had the Angles and Saxons in northern Europe, who gradually took control of Britain. So during the time of these invasions, these waves of invaders were coming in and attacking Roman cities like Padua and Treviso, which are inland from where Venice is today. The locals at the time were called the Veneti, and they began to flee to the islands of the Venetian lagoon to escape these hordes of invaders that were coming in. The invaders didn't have ships, and they weren't familiar with the Venetian lagoon, and as I'll show you in a minute, there are unpredictable tides, currents, there's heavy fog, so unless you really knew the lay of the lagoon, it would be very hard for an invader to follow you in there. So that's where the locals escaped to get away from the invading barbarians, quote unquote. This is the Venetian lagoon, Venice right in the middle of the picture there. The lagoon's total area here, it's only 9% of it is made up of actual islands. 11% is open sea, and the rest of it, 80% of it, are all salt marshes and mud flats that periodically get covered over by the high tides. So again, very unpredictable, very hard to navigate unless you know what you're doing. These are some pictures of the Venetian lagoon. As you can see, kind of muddy, salt flats. It would be very hard to navigate a large boat through here unless you really knew what you were doing. I like the picture in the lower right. That's some of the fog on the lagoon on a typical day. So again, this was kind of the place to hide out from the invading barbarians. So usually people say that Venice was founded officially in 421 AD. And the very first island that had a permanent population was the island of Torcello, which is in the far northeastern corner of the Venetian lagoon. But for the next few years, the Veneti moved back and forth between the islands and the mainland, depending on who was invading at that time. So when invading forces would come in, they would run up to the islands. When it was safe, they would go back to the mainland, and they went back and forth for several decades. But finally, an attack by Attila the Hun in 452 led many people to say, okay, we've had enough of this, and they set up permanently a settlement on the Venetian islands in the lagoon. And the early residents pretty much survived from fishing and from salt production. This is the island of Torcello. Today, I think it has something like 30 residents. You can go out there if you're visiting Venice, and that cathedral was built in 864, and the campanile was added in 1008. You know, here in New England, we pride ourselves on our old buildings, but they kind of put us to shame when you're talking about 1,000-year-old structures. So how did Venice take shape as a city? It really took hundreds of years of people gradually moving to the lagoon and doing various things to it to manipulate it to make it livable. So first of all, they dredged the lagoon out, creating channels to navigate through. They diverted the course of nearby rivers. They built islands or connected islands with sand and mud and clay. And then they began driving hardwood tree trunks into the water, 60 feet deep, into the clay that was the foundation below all that. So normally if you put wood into water, it's going to rot. But when it was driven down into these layers of clay, it actually petrified. It became hardened like cement. And likewise, wood that's exposed to water was sandblasted by all the sediments that go in and out with the tides of the lagoon. And so that sandblasting of the wood also petrified the wood and made it solid. Once they did this, once they had driven all these trees into the clay, they then put wooden structures on top of that, and they built the city on top of those. So just the sheer wonder that they could do this is amazing. But again, it took hundreds of years. Venice wasn't built in a day like Rome. Is there a quick question?
How did they physically drive these 60 feet into the ground?
It took a few hundred years. A lot of manpower. It's one of the things about Venice that just fascinates me, because I feel like it never should have been there. It's a miracle that it's even there. But so here's a view. 2 layers of wood were placed on top of those wooden pilings, and then they built the city on top of that. So this is an aerial view of part of Venice, and imagine all of these structures are built on wooden platforms, and there is some solid land. There are some solid islands there, but 100,000 of those wooden platforms underlie the city of Venice. Isn't that crazy? So around this time, you had the rise of the city-states. As Rome kind of deteriorated, various cities from the Roman Empire became city-states. Some of the biggest ones were Milan, Florence, Genoa, Pisa, Siena, and Amalfi. And they all became trading communities. They were relatively independent of one another, and oftentimes they warred with one another. And Venice became one of those city-states as well. It gained a lot of its wealth from trading and shipping. So it was kind of a central location on the Adriatic Sea. So it became a major trade port.
Did they speak the same language?
No, there were probably lots of different dialects and so on. It wasn't unified until Italy became a country thousands of years, a couple of 800 years later or so.
Today they have different dialects.
Yes, and in fact the Venetian dialect is really hard to understand. And I speak some Italian, but it's difficult. In 828, the body of St. Mark was smuggled from Egypt to Venice, and San Marco became the patron saint of the city, and they built the Basilica of San Marco to house the relics of St. Mark. And these are some pictures of the Basilica of San Marco. It's an amazing structure. It was constructed, they began construction in 1063, but it took them 400 or 500 years to complete it and get it to the present state that it's in. It's an absolutely amazing, I think second only to St. Peter's. It's just phenomenal inside. It'll take your breath away. So Venice started to rise to fame and power. Its primary rival was Genoa, which is on the west coast of Italy. And these 2 cities competed for dominance in the area for the next several hundred years. They went to war at least 5 separate times. But by 1000 AD, Venice had pretty much controlled the Adriatic Sea. And it had much of the coast of Croatia. It had a lot of the Greek islands. And by the beginning of the 13th century, that is when the city really reached the height of its power. It dominated commercial traffic around the Mediterranean and all the trade routes into the Orient. This is a map. The blue represents the Venetian Empire, or the Republic of Venice. So as you see, they had the entire western coast of Croatia and down into the Greek islands as well, including Crete. Aside from the trade, which became so important, they also became famous for silk and glass making. Those were the predominant industries in the city. And Venice, at that point, became the richest city in all of Europe. The citizens there had great personal freedom. It was written that they had a great deal of tolerance for all. It was a melting pot of all different cultures coming through and trading. And so there was great tolerance for different opinions, different religions and races and social classes and so on. And the Republic flourished for hundreds of years, and it was nicknamed at the time La Serenissima, which means the most serene. And I think that is a fitting name even today. One of Venice's most famous citizens was Marco Polo. He was more than just a swimming pool game for children. He was a merchant, a traveler, and a writer. He spent a lot of time in China, India, and Japan. He met the Mongolian Empire's ruler, Kublai Khan. He recorded his experiences in a book he titled Book of the Marvels of the World. The subtitle was The Travels of Marco Polo. And it's believed that that book inspired Christopher Columbus to want to undertake his journeys. Well, a particularly dark period in European history in general, and of course for Venice as well, was the Black Death or the bubonic plague. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, there were many, many outbreaks of bubonic plague around Europe. Venice had at least 20 outbreaks in that time period. One of the worst was in 1630. The plague killed 46,000 people, which was 1/3 of the city's population. So in 1631, the Doge, not the one that Elon Musk did, the Doge is like the mayor or the governor of the Republic, he appealed to the Virgin Mary to protect the city from plague. And so at that point, he commissioned the building of a great church in her honor, which is called Santa Maria della Salute, which means Saint Mary of Health. And this is Santa Maria della Salute. It was completed in 1681. It houses art that specializes on the plague, and it was probably one of Venice's most popular landmarks. It's my favorite building. I have so many pictures of this church, it's kind of embarrassing. And you'll probably see about 24 of them today. Going back to how Venice was built, 1 million tree trunks were driven into the lagoon as the base of that building. It's just hard to even comprehend. It is a miracle. So, like the Roman Empire before it, the Republic begins to decline. Some of the things that contributed to that were the discovery of North and South America, which led to new trade routes across the Atlantic. Venice just couldn't compete with that. It was mostly, centered on the Adriatic Sea and the Mediterranean. We also had the rise of the Ottoman Empire in the east, and that led to many wars with the Turks over the next 300 years, and Venice slowly began to lose a lot of its properties in the Adriatic Sea. And then weakened by plague, Venice became vulnerable to attacks from other cities in what is now Italy, so like Genoa and Milan, and also to other countries. France, Spain, and Austria all attacked the Venetian Republic. So the Republic really came to an end in 1797. Napoleon defeated the Venetian Republic and took it over. And then he was defeated in 1815, and it fell under Austrian rule. And the city at that point remained culturally important. They were known for theater and opera and music, but it had no political or military influence at that point from then on. The Austrians actually created a railroad bridge that connected Venice to the mainland for the first time. And in 1866, finally, Venice threw off Austrian rule and became part of the newly founded Kingdom of Italy. And then modern Venice. By the late 1800s, Venice had become really important as a manufacturing center and as a tourist attraction. Mussolini built the first road that connected Venice to the mainland. And one thing, if Mussolini did anything right, he moved a lot of the manufacturing from the city itself to the mainland areas of Margara and Mestre. And if you've been to Venice, you may have come in by train or by car, and you may see these ghastly outskirts of Venice. You come in and you think, oh, this is what I paid all this money to see. There are oil refineries and factories, and it's really ugly. And then you get on the causeway and you go out to Venice, and it's absolutely stunning and beautiful, as you know if you've been there. So Mussolini was responsible for moving all that manufacturing to the mainland off the islands. During World War II, thankfully, Venice was not damaged. Mainland areas were really bombed heavily because of the industries there. And the Veneto region was noted as being one of the strongholds of opposition against the Nazis and Mussolini. So Venice today. The city consists of 118, or is it 124, or is it 126? If you Google search, you'll find various estimates. So it's around 120. There's all these islands. They are connected with over 400 bridges, and many of the islands are crisscrossed, of course, by various canals. Some of the important islands, again, there are 118 of them. I'm not going to take you through each one, but some of the important ones, there's San Michele, which is also called Cimitero, and they actually moved all of the cemetery is located on one island. So they didn't want to bury any of the bodies on the island itself. So as you sail off from the main island of Venice, you'll see Cimitero. It's where all the tombs are. There is Murano, which is famous for the Murano glass that they make there, the glass factories. And they actually moved the glass furnaces to Murano back as early as the 13th century because fires from the glass factories would catch and burn half the city down. So they decided to put them all on one island. Burano is the lace. They became famous for creating lace, but they also are a fishing community, and it's a really popular tourist destination. I'll show you some pictures of it as we go. And then there's Lido, which is a seaside resort. It's actually on the Adriatic itself, and that's where you have the hotels and the beaches. So here's a lay of the land, or the lay of the islands, to give you just some sense of how it's all put together. So this is the main center of Venice, where most of the tourist attractions are. Here's San Michele, or the cemetery island. Here is the Lido, out on the Adriatic. Torcello, the original island, Burano, and Murano. And then here's Mestre and Margara, the really ugly suburbs with all the industry, and the airports over here. These are some shots of Murano, the glass island, that you can go and get tours of how they make the glass there. And of course, they sell the beautiful things. There's just every shape and configuration you can imagine of Murano glass. And the shopkeepers in Venice are very, very insistent that you buy only Murano glass. There's evidently a lot of Chinese knockoffs. And they say, you'll go into a shop and they'll say, this is real Murano glass, don't buy these other things. So the Murano glass, it's a wonderful souvenir to take away, and you can get it in virtually any form. Burano, probably my favorite part of Venice. The houses are, evidently the rumor is that the houses were painted these primary colors so that fishermen out in the lagoon in the fog could actually spot their homes when they were coming home. And so you can see it for miles as you're taking the boat out to Burano. It's very, very distinct. And it's just a photographer's dream. It's just, I can't stop taking pictures on Burano. And it changes with the light and the time of day. Some other shots of Burano. This is an amazingly tilted bell tower. It's not a famous one like the Leaning Tower, but it's pretty impressive. And again, you can see Burano from a distance, all the different colored homes. Here's a map of the main island that Venice is situated on. So San Marco, the famous San Marco Square, and the Basilica that I just talked about, and so on, is all in San Marco. The city, kind of like New York has boroughs, Venice is divided into 6 sestieri, or districts. And so this island makes up the main 6 sestieri. And this down the middle is the Grand Canal. And here's an aerial view of Venice, so you actually get to see what it looks like. This is the causeway that comes over from the mainland. And then this is the Grand Canal that runs through, and here's San Marco Square. So getting around in Venice is always exciting. There are several different ways to travel in Venice. My favorite is the Vaporetti, which are water buses. And this is a Vaporetto. Oops, sorry. Hello. This is a Vaporetto. They probably hold about 100 people or so. And this is a bus stop, basically, where the Vaporettos stop. I love the way they stop. They just kind of slam into the docks. There was one time I went to Venice and I got a beautiful hotel room. It was right above the Grand Canal. It was this, perfect view. All night long, every few minutes, boom, as these things just ram into the docks. But it's part of the color of the city. But Vaporettos are the cheapest way to get around. A single ride is something like $8 now. But what you want to do if you're going to Venice is you buy a 2-day or a 3-day pass, and then it's unlimited rides, and that's definitely the way to go. There are taxis. In this picture here, this is kind of a traffic jam on the Grand Canal. Here's a Vaporetto, and these little white motorboats are taxis. Taxis are only taken by really wealthy people and tourists because they're very, that's okay. All set? They're very, very expensive. And so locals do get a discount on them, but if you're a tourist, it will cost you $50 or $60 to take a taxi. So you're definitely better off on a Vaporetto. One other interesting mode of transportation in Venice are what are called traghetti. And what it is it's the traditional gondolas that you see, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But basically, actually, let me go back. As I showed you here, this is the Grand Canal. There are only 3 bridges that cross the Grand Canal in the whole city. And so if you are caught over here somewhere, you would have to walk all the way over here to the Rialto Bridge, or you'd have to walk all the way over here to the Accademia Bridge. So the traghetti will take you directly across the Grand Canal in a minute or so you don't have to walk all the way down to the next bridge. They charge something like $1 to do that, €1. And if you're a local or if you're a risk taker, basically the locals stand up on them. It's really bad form to sit down on a traghetti, but they'll put up with it if you're a tourist. But anyway, they will get you directly across the canal. And if you can't afford a gondola ride, which I'll talk about in a minute, this might be your second best option. At least you can experience what it's like to be on a gondola. The gondolas have been in use since the 11th century. And they estimate that by the 17th and 18th century, there were 10,000 of these suckers running around the city. It's pretty amazing. Today, we're down to about 400 of them that are still in use. And they're almost exclusively used by tourists. A local would not be caught dead on a gondola unless it was a traghetti. The cost for riding a gondola is about $100 for a 30-minute ride. It goes up at night when it's more romantic. But that is per boat. That's not per person. So if you can grab 3 or 4 people or family members and all go, you can split the cost. And it's really not so bad. And it's kind of a must thing that you have to do when you're in Venice. The story of the gondolieri, the people that run the gondolas, is really interesting. In order to qualify to be a gondolier, you have to have 400 hours of instruction, not just about how to navigate the canals and so on, but you have to learn about the culture of the city and the history of the city, because they're like amateur tour guides that will tell you about the city. They have to pass the exam in order to get licensed. And only a few licenses are given in any given year. Right now, there are approximately 430 gondoliers in the city. And typically, it was a profession that was passed from father to son. But still, you couldn't, just because you were a gondolier's son, you couldn't just hope to get your own gondola, but you had to go through the exam and get licensed. It's a very lucrative career. They make about $150,000 a year, so not too shabby, but it is really hard work. And the first female gondolier just received her license. It was definitely a male-dominated profession. But in 2010, she got her license, and now there are 13 more female gondoliers at this point. And here are some pictures. That's me with one of my work colleagues on a gondola. And just some pictures in this picture here gives you a sense of what it's like to be in the gondola riding down one of the narrow canals. I think my friend Carol, who's here today, I think that was when we were together riding on the gondola. So let me tell you a little bit about the shrinking population in Venice. It's really pretty dramatic, and it's one of the biggest threats to the city today. Here we have the 1960 statistics. So the total population, mainland and all the islands combined, was about 350,000 people. Of those, 145,000 lived in what's called the Centro Storico, which is that main big island with the 6 sestieri. Other islands, about 50,000 people lived on those, and then 155,000 people lived over in the mainland in Mestre and Marghera. Contrast that with 2024. The total population has dropped by 100,000 people. And now look at how they're distributed. In the central part of the city, the main island of Venice, there's only 50,000 people. On the other islands, 25,000 people, and a lot more have moved to the mainland. The reasons for all this: tourism. If you've been to Venice in the height of summer or in the middle of the day when all the tourists are there, it can be a real drag. Imagine trying to go grocery shopping and bring your groceries home and fight the crowds. So the tourist crowds have definitely contributed to this. There's also a very high cost of living in Venice. It's much higher than in other Italian cities. The average age of the city is 4 years older than Italy as a whole. And you might think that's kind of odd because if it's so expensive, but these are people probably that have lived there all their lives. They own their property and they're going to stay there for the rest of their lives. So it tends to be a very elderly population who are still living there. Some pictures I gathered of La Gente, the Venetian people. One of my favorite things to do in Italy in general is just to people watch, and Venice is a wonderful place to do that. So here we have a whole group of people watching a soccer match in a courtyard. And if you've ever been in Italy during a soccer match, they are very rabid fans. Here is one of the ever-patient Vaporetto operators who has to manipulate the crowd and let them on and off and tell people to stop when it's too crowded and so on. I love this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures that I've ever taken. It was on Burano, and I stopped to take a picture of this woman, and I said her plants were really beautiful, and I said, "May I take your picture?" And she said yes. And then I said, "Let me show it to you." And she said, "Oh, I'm blind." And it was just so sweet. But I said, "Well, your garden is beautiful, and so are you." You know, it was just really charming. Here was a wedding taking place in Venice. We can't get away from cell phones, even in Venice. Here's baby Jessica. She was with a family that was at a gelateria. Here's a fishmonger at one of the marketplaces, yelling for people to come over and buy fish. No trip to Italy or Venice would be complete without talking about the food situation. So there's some unique aspects of Italy and of Venice in this regard. Breakfast in Italy and in France as well tends to be very light. They usually do coffee and pastry of some kind. There's eggs and bacon and pancakes. It's the only thing I don't like about Italy. I'd have to introduce pancakes to Italians. But basically, this is an Italian breakfast, a couple of different croissants or pastries, cappuccino. They do have donuts. But a couple of things that are unique to Venice, there are what are called cicchetti, which are kind of Venetian version of tapas that the Spanish do. So it's little snacks in the afternoon. It can be salami, fried vegetables, that kind of thing. And it's seen as a snack. And then there's also tremezzini, which means they call it the little in-between. And so they're little sandwiches that you might have in the middle of the afternoon, because usually they're very strict with their dining rules in Italy. Lunch is pretty much from 12:30 to 2 or 2:30. And then everything closes again, and all you might be able to get is a slice of pizza. So, but you can get tramezzini and have a little sandwich during the day, because then restaurants don't usually open until 8 p.m. for dinner. So these are different sandwiches that are available. They're really good and they're really cheap. You can get like 3 of them for $5. And they have crab meat and, let's see, I wanted to show you one of these. Yeah, this is cavallo, which is horse. A Venetian specialty is horse meat. They do eat horse meat. They actually they serve it like steak with lemon. And I went with a group of students once, and of course they were like the reaction I just got here. People are, oh, horse meat. My students were horrified, and we went to a pizzeria, and I ordered a horse meat pizza. And every single one of them, can we try it? It's like, so. But it is a Venetian dish for sure. Tastes like beef. Doesn't taste like chicken. Tastes like beef. It's like a lean beef. They do, I mean, food is art in Italy. You know, the salads are just amazing. And of course, appetizers like prosciutto and melon. This is a restaurant that I love in Venice that serves a pumpkin flan. This is an appetizer. Very, very good. This is a seafood salad. Pasta is, of course, a mainstay there, although they eat in the northeast of Italy, they eat a lot of polenta. In fact, people in other parts of Italy call the Venetians polentini, the people that eat polenta. But they do have pasta. One of the unique things that you find there is the black squid ink pasta. So they actually add the squid ink to the pasta. Has a really wonderful flavor. This was an amazing dish. It's so pretty. But it's fresh shrimp and the squid ink pasta and sun-dried tomatoes. And it's just unbelievable. This is called black and white pasta. It has the squid ink and some regular pasta. Everything has clams and scallops, and it's wonderful. And of course, we cannot forget dessert. My favorite Italian thing is gelato, of course, and Suso is a place in Venice that has the best gelato, I think, in all of Italy. It's just, I was there like 2 times a day, every day. This is a thing called a budino, which is kind of like a pudding. That was a raspberry budino with chocolate, or strawberry, I guess it was. This, I think, Carol, I think this was your dessert when we went. This was it fresh cantaloupe, and cantaloupe gelato floating in champagne. Very refreshing. Chocolate torte with orange, and this is traditional dessert in Venice is tiramisu. Tiramisu was invented in Venice, and this is some of the best. Venice, of course, is famous for its version of the Mardi Gras, which is Carnevale, and they attract approximately 3 million revelers every year. I've never been there for Mardi Gras. I've never been to New Orleans for Mardi Gras. I don't think I'd want to. I just don't do crowds like that. I would rather have the city to myself than share it with 3 million other people. But it looks quite festive the way they've got it all lit up and decorated. And of course, you can buy the famous Carnevale masks in many of the shops in Venice. So one of the biggest problems, speaking of crowds, is the impact that mass tourism has had on places like Venice. Venice has been a tourist destination since the Grand Tour of Europe back in the 1600s. Wealthy families from England and France would send their children on a tour all across Europe to see the antiquities in Greece and Italy and so on. And so Venice was one of the stops on that grand tour. After World War II, tourism became its primary source of income. And now Venice gets between 25 and 30 million tourists a year. And remember I said that the population is about 250,000. So imagine that kind of strain on a city. More than half of those visitors are cruise ship passengers or day trippers. So they come into the city and they leave the same day. Some of the problems that this causes is the local residents, there are no real stores. There's all kinds of little souvenir shops, but there's no real places to buy quality goods and groceries and so on. Everything involves a crowd or a line trying to get on the Vaporetto, the bus. You're fighting with all these tourists and their luggage. There's constant noise from roller bags, and trust me, roller bags are one of the greatest inventions known to a traveler. I love mine, but they clack, clack, clack up and down all the bridges and the brick sidewalks, and it drives the locals crazy. There are very few jobs in the city except in the tourist industry these days. And now with the increase in Airbnb rentals, that's created housing shortages and real big spikes in rent. So on the plus side, residents do get a reduced fare on the public transportation, on taxis, on admission to the museums and that kind of thing, but it really doesn't compensate for the higher cost of living that Venice has compared to other parts of Italy. My friend Carol, who's with me here today, we had rented an apartment in Venice. We had a rooftop patio, and we were sitting out one day enjoying the city, and it was like the scene from Independence Day where the mothership comes in. We just looked and said, what is this? Look at this. So the cruise ship hours, at peak hours, when thousands of people disembark from these cruise ships, they just totally flood the popular tourist destinations like Piazza San Marco and the Rialto Bridge area. One of the things about the cruise ship passengers, if you are a person who just goes like I do and go and stay at a hotel in Venice, you pay a city tax each night. It's 2, 3, 4 euro per night, and that goes to the city. Cruise ship passengers do not pay that. And on top of that, if you're on a cruise, where do you eat? You eat your huge buffets on board ship. So they wander through the city and they might get some junk food and the soda, and so they're not patronizing the restaurants in the city, and they're just buying, I love Venice souvenirs that were made in China. They're not buying real Murano glass. And so it's really a problem. The city is experiencing all this wear and tear and not benefiting at all from any of it. In addition, you saw that picture I just showed you. The waves from these oversized ships coming into the lagoon damage the already fragile foundations of a lot of these ancient buildings. I didn't even pay you to ask that question, but it's coming. Give me another slide. So there are many people that are fighting for this kind of thing. Here's a demonstration happening in the water out in front of a tour boat. These are people protesting the roller bags. This says, Venezia non è un albergo, which means Venice isn't a hotel. And Venice non è Disneyland. I think that one speaks for itself. So locals are worried that it's just becoming like an amusement park and it's losing its character as a real live living city. So thank the powers that be. In 2021, Venice banned all but the smallest cruise ships. So they can no longer dock on the lagoon in the central part of the city. They now have to dock, I think, about 30 or 40 miles down the coast, and they bring them up in much smaller boats, and it's a godsend. There have been new proposals to ban roller bags. That's when I'm always living in mortal terror that they'll pass that. But I try to be really quiet when I bring my bag. And there are also calls to limit the number of visitors. There's been talk about installing turnstiles to enter the city and paying an admission fee to come in. If you're a hotel stayer, if you show your voucher for your hotel, they would let you in. But if you're just coming for the day, you'd have to pay an admission fee. And I see what they're trying to do there. It does give that sense of it being an amusement park. They have passed it, but I think they're only doing it on really, really busy holidays and like for Carnevale. So it's a limited solution. Another interesting threat that Venice suffers is what's called acqua alta, which means high water. Acqua alta it's an abnormally high tide that's related to the phases of the moon, and it happens when there are certain wind and weather conditions in the Adriatic. It's more common in the winter months. It can happen at any time of year, but it's more common in the winter. And typically on an average year, 4 times a year, you will have an acqua alta that's about 3.5 feet above normal tides. The acqua alta has always affected the city. The earliest records of it, it was doing this. So it's not a new phenomenon at all. It's always affected the city. The worst one on record was in 1966, where tides went 6.5 feet above normal. And there were 2 years in a row, 2018 and 19, where it hit between 5 and 6 feet above normal. The city's response to an acqua alta, emergency sirens go off about 3 or 4 hours in advance. So you hear these like air raid sirens, and it's like, uh-oh, the high water is coming. And so they erect elevated walkways, like you see here, in popular areas, so people can use those to get across flooded canals or flooded squares and so on. And they also, a lot of the stores will sell these really cheap, ugly blue galoshes or some people just buy trash bags and use an elastic and tie them up on their legs so that you can wade through the waters. I've been there for several acqua alta. It's actually kind of fun. But here's an example of what it looks like. This is the Piazza San Marco. It's lined with all kinds of wonderful cafes and restaurants, and that's the Basilica of San Marco at the end of those there. You're just sitting here having your coffee and listening to music, and suddenly you look behind and water is seeping up from the drains. It's coming in from the lagoon. And after an hour or so, it can totally fill the Piazza San Marco. That's probably about 1 foot deep, maybe a little more than that. It's really pretty. It's like suddenly the Piazza San Marco becomes this giant swimming pool or reflecting pool. There I am with my fashionable blue galoshes. But that's what happens, and it lasts as long as a high tide lasts, so it might be 3 or 4 hours, and then it begins to subside again. Also, if you're near the lagoon, oftentimes waves will come up onto the sidewalk from the lagoon itself. There's some speculation that acqua alta is happening a little more frequently lately, but they're not really sure about that. And of course, everyone talks about global climate change and rising sea levels, but really people do not think that is the issue here. What is happening for sure is that Venice is sinking. We have taken water out from the underground aquifers under it. We've also taken natural gas out from under it. So the city is subsiding. That tower, if you remember the picture I showed you of Burano where the tower was leaning, that's subsidence. That's simply the ground is giving way and sinking a bit. So that's the major problem. Venice is sinking rather than the ocean really rising that much. But this was not my own picture, but this was from a news report. But here are people in a restaurant. Here's the waiter wading through water to serve them. And here's one of those walkways again. It's pretty interesting. There's an aspect of Italian culture called la bella figura, which means putting on your best appearance, always wanting to look good in public. And it's kind of hard to do that with those hideous galoshes. But this is my dear friend Claudia, who lives outside of Venice, but I think she carries it off pretty well. She looks pretty fashionable. Marco, her husband Marco, and I, not so much. One of the solutions to acqua alta to try and protect the city is MOSE, and it's a gated system that they're building across the lagoon. What will happen is when there is higher tide coming in with certain weather conditions, the wall will actually rise and hold the lagoon back to keep it from flooding the city. Construction began back in 2003. They think it's going to be finished this year, but this is Italy. It's like, oh, it could be this year, it could be in 2030. It is controversial because it's cost a fortune to build it, and people are worried about the effect it's going to have on wildlife and whether or not there'll be desalinization of the lagoon or an excess pollution of the lagoon and so on. So without any possible solution, there's always possible drawbacks as well. This is one of my favorite pictures. You can't see this anymore, but this was a temporary art exhibit on the Grand Canal. It was called Support. And I'm so happy I was in Venice when it was up, because it was just the most dramatic thing to come around a bend in the Grand Canal and see these beautiful hands holding up a building. And it's just kind of trying to represent the fragility of Venice, that it's, you know, it's up against the sea. So the rest of my slides are kind of a photo tour of the city, some of my favorite pictures. I must have on my computer, I would wager 3,000 photos of Venice. And every time I go, it's like, okay, Matt, you have taken 27,000 pictures. You don't need any more pictures of Santa Maria della Salute. And then it's like, oh, damn, I've never seen it in that light before. I've never seen it with the shadows on. So I just keep taking pictures. So I've tried to really cull through and pick out the best of the best here. And that's one of my favorite pictures of me. I asked a fellow tourist to take that, but that is me in my happy place on the Vaporetto. One of the squares in Venice, there are green spaces and squares like this. And again, as is typical in all of Italy, you have families gathering, having their ice cream, the kids playing ball. It's a wonderful place to just people watch. I like this quote from Nietzsche: "When I seek another word for music, I never find any other word than Venice." And that's one of the bands playing along the Piazza San Marco. You get free entertainment sitting there if you are willing to pay $15 for a cappuccino. How much was our grilled cheese, Carol? Like a $30 grilled cheese sandwich, but you get free music. It is definitely a city of music. There's musicians everywhere performing. An ice cream shop. I love that. I want that window in my apartment. Although I'd be hungry for ice cream all the time. I love the light in Venice. This is one of the problems about wanting to keep taking pictures. It looks different in the summer when it's really hazy and misty, and then in the winter it's crystal clear and crisp. It's always changing. I remember taking that picture. I was trying to come up with a caption for it, and I just wrote, "I love this picture." The colors were just so vivid. There's a Vaporetto lumbering down the Grand Canal. The best thing to do on a Vaporetto is you fight everybody and you get to the back, and there are seats outside on the back. And then if you can get on at the beginning of the first stop and then just ride it the whole length of the Grand Canal, it takes about an hour and a half, and it's just the best way to see the city. I would just ride up and down the canal. There's my favorite building again, Santa Maria della Salute. And as I said earlier, one of the things that impresses me about Venice is I think it's a miracle that it was ever built, and that it's still there after 1,600 years or so is just phenomenal. Beautiful sunset. Again, just the different patterns that you get of the sun on the water. Some of the canals. It's kind of like every time you go around a bend, there's just something else to see. Some amazing church like that.
I was going to say, is that also there?
What's that?
Is that like just a wall?
No, actually, those are two separate pictures. I should have clarified that, but I think it looks so, they look so cool together that I just, but no, they are so. That would be really cool though if they could do that, huh? Thanks for bringing that up. I don't want to mislead you. Again, 2 different pictures here. And this is, yeah, laundry is a tourist attraction. It's just beautiful. Who would think that your clean laundry would be a decoration? That ship and the boat on the lower right-hand corner, that's actually a produce market. So you walk aboard the boat and they have all kinds of fruit and vegetables for sale. Everything is in boats. The police are in boats, garbage trucks are in boats, ambulances are boats. Here's a view. What's that?
Does every home have a boat?
No. People couldn't afford it. But some people do. A lot of people have private boats, and fishermen, of course, have their rowboats and stuff, but no, not by no means would it. I would say the majority of people would not have their own boat. They walk and they take the Vaporetto.
Go shopping?
You walk, or you take the Vaporetto. You can get on the water bus and go down to your stop and get off, just the way we do in the city with buses. This is from the top of the Campanile in San Marco, looking down on all the red roofs and the domes of San Marco.
How do they connect all the sewage?
God only knows.
Oh, I know.
I'd have to research that and come back to you with a second presentation. Venice is, I wonder what a draw that would be, Venice's sewer system, today. But it is, again, miraculous how they do it. This is Christmas time on the Piazza San Marco. Again, Piazza San Marco with all the outdoor cafes lining the sides of it. This, in this picture, is the famous Bridge of Sighs. This connects the Doge's palace with the prison, and evidently prisoners who were sentenced to jail would walk across this, and so it was called the Bridge of Sighs because they knew they were going to prison. More festive laundry. And again, you see why I keep taking pictures. I mean, this was a really cool shot, but then when the lights came on, it became more atmospheric. And I was like, oh, I got to take a picture of that.
It's a whole different look.
Yep, absolutely.
And where did they get the lumber to start building on?
From the mainland.
From the mainland?
Yep.
Mainland?
So again, imagine the million trees that they used for the one church, and they had to get all of that from the mainland and transport it across the lagoon.
Yeah,
Sure.
I came in a couple of minutes late. Why did they build it on water?
It's a long story. That was the beginning of my presentation. They wanted to escape from barbarian invasions, and so they built out in the mud flats where they could escape and eventually settled there.
How long did it take for them to get to be able to stay there on the
It was several hundred years
several hundred
as they were creating it, yep. I'm almost done, so let me just finish up and then I'm happy to take questions. Again, here we go, different light, different color. I've got to take a picture of that. That seagull was so cooperative.
You photoshopped.
I didn't. I never Photoshop anything. I don't really.
Taking a picture of that seagull.
I was taking a picture of that. He just happened to get in the way, but it was perfect.
Do they have a university there?
There's an academia for art in the city itself, but the nearest university is Padova, which is about 30 miles away. This is one of my favorite pictures I've ever taken. I just was at the right place at the right time. I called it the mothership lands in Venice.
Is that
That's just the reflections of the light on the water.
Wow, that's beautiful.
I was talking with someone before the presentation. A lot of people go to Venice on a day trip. In fact, one of the trips when I was taking my students, the tour director that was working on the trip with me, she said, well, it's too expensive to have them stay in Venice for a few days, so we'll just take them on a bus trip up to Venice for a day from Florence. And I said, oh, no, you will not. So I made them, it added expense to the trip, but we spent 3 days in Venice itself. Students said it was by far their favorite part of the whole trip. You know, you can't just go to Venice for an afternoon. It's just... This is my favorite thing to do at night. I, again, get on the Vaporetto, get out on that back seat, and I don't care if it's freezing outside. I bundle up in my coat and hat, but I'm outside looking at this go by. When the fog comes in, it just adds a whole different element to things. There's the famous Rialto Bridge, one of the 3 bridges that crosses the canal. And that's the view from the Rialto Bridge. Here's the Vaporetto, Here's the Vaporetto stopped at the bus stop, and then there are all cafes and restaurants lining the Grand Canal to have dinner. I love this quote from Woody Allen. Venice is the most romantic place in the world, but it's even better when there's no one around. And I love this picture. This is Venice at night. All the cruise ship people leave. You have the whole city to yourself. It's quiet, it's cool, it's relaxing. It's my favorite time of day there. You hear the lapping of the water in the canals. You hear the seagulls. You hear boats plying down a canal. And I love walking, listening to people having their dinner in the apartments above. That's Christmas time in Venice. So, to conclude, may Serenissima, more cooperative seagulls, I swear. So may La Serenissima thrive for another 1,500 years. Let's go. Logan's only an hour away. So just a few things about me, and then I'll start taking questions. I have on the table over here, sorry to blind you with my pointer. I do have copies of my book for sale. It's called At Home in the World, Reflections of a Travel Addict. It's my travels, it's a travel memoir about my visits to 13 different countries. There is one chapter about Italy, but it's a travel memoir. It's a fun book, a fun read. It is available on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com, but I do have copies for sale. I ask $20 for it. Either cash or check is fine, and I'm happy to autograph them for you if you'd like. If you don't want a book, there are bookmarks and my card on the table as well. The bookmark has my website address on it, which is this, matt@homeintheworld.com. I have a website where I have a lot of my travel blogs, a lot of domestic travel, a lot of trips, stories about countries that didn't get into the book, and so on. And I think that's it. So.